Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program, Women in Genocide. I'd like to start by thanking our community partners for this program. We sincerely appreciate your support and partnership. Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas, Big Brothers Big Sisters Lone Star, Congregation Anshe Torah, Mental Health America of Greater Dallas, Mosaic Family Services, and Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our museum members and board members joining us this evening. We can do programs like tonight without your incredible continued support. So thank you so much. We present tonight's program as part of our permanent exhibition highlight series, which expands on themes from the museum's permanent exhibition. Shortly, we will hear about the experiences of women in genocide as victims, perpetrators, and survivors. If you have not had a chance to visit the museum, I invite you to do so and explore our 10 Stages of Genocide gallery, where we explore 10 historical and contemporary genocides through the lens of Dr. Gregory Stanton's model, the 10 Stages of Genocide. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce tonight's panelist and moderator. Sarah E. Brown is the Executive Director of Change, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education. She holds the first PhD in Comparative Genocide Studies from Clark University's Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She has worked and conducted research in Rwanda since 2004, serving as project coordinator in refugee camps in Tanzania, worked in refugee settlement in Texas, and researched conflict globalization. Sarah M. Cushman is director of the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University and lecturer in the history department. She has been involved in Holocaust education and scholarship for 2 decades, and her research centers on women's experiences during the Holocaust. She is currently working on her first book, Auschwitz, the Women's Camp, and has written several related articles. Kachi Muradian is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. He is the author of Resistance Network, the Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915 to 1918. In 2021, he was appointed the Armenian and Georgian Area Specialist in the African and Middle Eastern Division at the Library of Congress. And our moderator tonight is Eliza Bimparad, Professor of History and Unger Chair in East European Jewish History and the Holocaust at Queens College and SUNY Graduate Center. She's the author of Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk and Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murders in the Lands of the Soviets, and the co-editor of Women in Genocide, Survivors, Victims, Perpetrators, and Pogroms, a Documentary History. We have plenty of time for questions at the end of this program, so as usual, please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. And now it is my honor to turn this over to our incredible panelists. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this generous introduction. It is truly an honor to moderate this session. I know that we are in for a treat. I know for myself that I will be learning a lot tonight, and it is truly an honor to moderate this session. So let's dive in with the first question. I would like to start by asking each panelist to share briefly 2 or 3 minutes, how your work relates to this topic and why you think it is important to study the experience of women in the context of genocide. So Sarah, I think
yes,
Sarah.
Hi. Thank you so much. And I would like to start by thanking, first of all, the Dallas Holocaust Museum for inviting me to be a part of this program, and to all the community partners as well. And I just want to say that I feel extremely privileged to be a part to be among this panel with Doctors Brown, Muradian, and Ben-Barad. Truly an honor. And I also want to thank all of you for attending this evening. It's really not so interesting to talk to an audience that's not there. So thank you so much for being here. Before I get into my response to the question, I would just like to take a few minutes. I think it's really important that when we're talking about mass atrocities that take place somewhere else overseas, that we take some time to think about the mass atrocities that have taken place in the places where we actually reside. And so with that in mind, I would like to acknowledge that the United States has yet to reckon with its history of slavery and its legacies, including the Jim Crow era and the ongoing systemic white supremacy that we see manifesting itself on a daily basis in this country. And I would also like to acknowledge the dozens, if not hundreds, of genocides against Indigenous peoples. And sort of in relation to that, I would like to just give a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land. In Dallas, the land on which Dallas sits is seized territory of the Wichita and Caddo affiliated tribes. And I am speaking to you from Northwestern University, whose campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 people who are, Illinois is home to over 100,000 people who are members of officially recognized tribes, and to hundreds of others who are members of not officially recognized tribes. So with regard to my own work, my research focuses on the women's camp in Auschwitz. And I mean, it clearly relates to the topic of women in genocide. Auschwitz was one of the places of the Nazi genocide against Jews, probably one of the most well-known places. The women's camp is less well known, but in that space, what we see is the interactions of three groups of women, including those who were working with and for the SS who ran the camps, women who were part of the prisoner hierarchy in the camp, and then also women who were common prisoners. And what we see is that they were living, toiling, trying to survive in this space. And we're going to talk further on about some of the specific ways that manifested. But I think what we learn from looking at this specific place is some of the particularities about how women participated in and affected genocide, and how they responded to genocide. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So I think Kachig now.
Thank you for having me, and it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be part of this panel as well. My work focuses on modern day Syria. What is modern day Syria, but what was during World War I, during the period when the Armenian genocide took place, part of the Ottoman Empire. And by focusing on this region, which is essentially a geographical triangle between Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and Deir ez-Zor, all again modern day Syria, I explore the experiences of Armenian deportees in what is one of the deadliest, if not the deadliest, sites of the Armenian genocide. And in this, as I do that, I focus on the role played by the group that is being targeted by the Armenians themselves in terms of organizing, and particularly in terms of forming this network this loosely connected of underground network that aims at assisting and supporting and saving many Armenians. This was a network that included local Muslims, Christians, Jews, as well as Western missionaries. At the core, at the center of the network, was a group of Armenians who were essentially the driving force of this effort. My work is called the Resistance Network because this is the focus of my first book. This is the focus of the narrative, this network. And in that context, I think in many ways the role of women is particularly significant, because what we see a number of elements that really help crystallize our understanding of how victims act, react, exercise agency in context of mass violence, and make choices. They can be choiceless choices, but they're choices still. So for instance, in this region, just to give two very quick examples, one thing that becomes extremely patently clear is how this network of Armenians and others, this humanitarian resistance network that engages in these efforts to save Armenians, initially is organized as a humanitarian operation, forming committees, largely around churches. It's predominantly patriarchal in structure, essentially following the general structures and power dynamics of communities. And ultimately, as the Ottoman Turkish authorities crack down on the operation and the network goes underground, we see how the role of women becomes more prominent. And the farther away you go from the centers of these of this operation, which is Aleppo, we see how more and more women will play a critical role in this, essentially challenging, if not only that, but also becoming key actors in times of war and genocide, and taking on roles and responsibilities that typically would not be essentially available for them to be part of. So that's one manifestation of it. The other being that, again, because my work focuses largely on unarmed forms of resistance, it really sheds light on the importance of looking at not just that sliver of resistance that is armed and violent, but also on less subtle forms of resistance, and the way in which, by doing that, we are really also broadening our understanding and including a much larger constituency of actors when we think about genocide and resistance to it, as opposed to just focusing on those who are capable, have access to, and are willing to take up arms.
Thank you so much, Kachik. And Sarah.
Thank you so much, Elisa, and thank you to the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum and all of your partners who made this program possible. I'm delighted to be here with my co-panelists, Sarah Cushman and Kachik Muradian. We've all been classmates in the past, and I am always inspired and delighted when I have a chance to have a conversation with the both of you. So it's really good to be here, and thank you to everyone in attendance. So for this part, I'm going to talk about a portion of my work. I'm going to put on my research and scholarship hat for a moment. And I work on the role played by women who exercise agency during genocide, examining their pre-genocide mobilization and sensitization actions they may have taken during the genocide. Now, some of them as rescuers, some of them as perpetrators, some of them as survivors, and often many of them as bystanders, which I argue was a choice. And then I also look at their post-genocide trajectories. The subject of my first book was women rescuers and perpetrators during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And so that's probably the place where I'm going to speak from the most, since I feel the most qualified to speak about that when talking about women in genocide. Now, the reason for my focus on women's agency and their experiences was because of this deafening silence that I encountered around the topic. While much has been written about the victimization of women, most of the literature that I encountered really didn't scrutinize women who rescued targeted victims of genocide in Rwanda or perpetrated crimes against humanity during the genocide. Women were traditionally cast as victims during mass violence. And here I really want to stress, women did suffer sex-specific abuse and violence during the genocide against the Tutsi. I mean, in Rwanda, it's, I believe the estimates were from the United Nations Special Rapporteur of the Commission on Human Rights. They estimated that between 250,000 and 500,000 women were targeted for genocidal rape in 1994. But here, and I actually pulled this quote so that I could quote it accurately, I want to quote the tremendous author and feminist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who says that the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And for me, when looking at Rwanda, this gender-based characterization of Rwandan women as victims or bystanders, it's incomplete, and it ignores the women who exercised agency to become rescuers or perpetrators. Now, that having been said, I want to include this caveat before we get into the conversation, which is that, as women in 1994 Rwanda, they were taking actions and making decisions and exercising agency in a very unique context. It was deeply patriarchal. Their agency was severely limited because of those patriarchal structures. And so when I set out to do this this study, I examined two diverging paths in particular that, I felt were very important and necessary when examining that limited agency that was those who rescued from genocide and those who perpetrated genocide. And briefly before I end, I just want to thank Sarah for that land acknowledgement. Our center is housed on the territory of the Lenni Lenape people, and I did appreciate that very much. So thank you.
So thank you so much. This is, we're getting started here. And I want to kind of piggyback on what Sarah, you just said. You mentioned the fact that the existing literature on women and genocide focuses primarily on women as victims, right? That's what we know most about. But still, I think it is important for us to start with that question and try to kind of really give a sense to our audience here how women experience genocide as victims in the context of violence and genocide that you three as wonderful scholars work on, and specifically, so the role of women as victims, sexual violence. What role does sexual violence play, and to what extent do women experience genocidal violence differently from men, even when we move away from the question of sexual violence. So we are not going to follow a specific order, so feel free to jump in. Anyone who's inspired by the question, just jump in.
Well, I was going to elect Khachik, but I see that he's still muted, so I can start us off. I mean, I think this is a really important question. And what I found in Rwanda was that there was very deliberate dehumanization and hypersexualization of Tutsi women in the pre-genocide and during the genocide stages, and that directly contributes to genocidal rape. And this was widespread, it was deliberate, it was with the intent to destroy in whole or in part Tutsi women. And I really want to say that they were built out as this threat, this inhuman other, this hypersexualized, impure, non-human being, not even a woman. And this was deliberately done by the media and the majority male leadership. And these depicting them as deviant seductresses was really meant to sanctify and allow and create a space for them to be harmed sexually. Now, I want to say something specifically about Hutu women here, because they were deliberately mobilized too to view their Tutsi quote unquote sisters as a threat. They were pressed to view the entire Tutsi population as a threat, but women in particular. And this was in part because of this false sense of competition that existed between them. This idea that, there was one survivor who reflected on this in particular to me, this idea that somehow the Tutsi women were in direct competition with the Hutu women for eligible eligible husbands. And so if you wipe out the Tutsi women, suddenly you'll be able to have access to more husbands. But something I want to say more broadly about Tutsi women versus Tutsi men in Rwanda pre-genocide and during the genocide is that Tutsi women were second-class citizens. You know, in 1994 Rwanda, they were not even legally recognized as the head of the household. The 1992 Rwanda Family Code recognized men. They were not able to open a bank account without the signature of a husband or a spouse or a male member of the house. And they represented less than 5% of the elected officials in the executive branch. So when they experienced genocide, when they were victims of genocide, they were victims in a decidedly marginalized and especially vulnerable position.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, perhaps since Sarah nominated me, I'll go next. So, let me again speak from the case that I know best, the Armenian genocide. In the case of the Armenian genocide, women were targeted. Whenever we talk about, let me take a step back. Whenever we talk about genocide and mass violence against women, there's the discussion of particularly genocidal rape often is one that operates in the context of violence, sexual violence that's happening in the context of the maelstrom of war, and on the one hand, and on the other, sexual violence as a weapon of genocide, right? And in the case of the Armenian genocide, we have both. There's this atmosphere of impunity, and in many ways you have very active participation by people in both engaging in rape and raping Armenian women during the process of the deportation of the Armenians. And at the same time, there is organized systematic violence and using rape as a weapon of genocide by the central authorities and local authorities that are essentially unleashing the process and dynamics of genocide. In this context, it's worth noting that when we talk about the differences of experience between men and women and how they experience genocide, perhaps it's worth noting that in the case of the Armenian genocide, we have even the victims themselves realize that even though everybody is targeted, women and men are targeted in different ways, and therefore we will see in countless testimonies efforts of women to try to pass as men or boys and the opposite. So in many cases, we'll see in accounts cases where in order to avoid being abducted or raped, women will cut their hair short or will dress up like men, and the opposite is true as well. In certain cases, particularly because men were targeted to be killed, some men are going to be disguised as women. So in many ways, this dynamic, perhaps it's best illustrated, the difference of the experience as victims and the gender element there from the very vantage point of the targeted group itself, because they themselves realized that this experience has its differences when it pertains to men and women. One final quick point, when we think about women as victims and women as perpetrators, bystanders, these categories that Sarah mentioned. In the case of the Armenian genocide, it's also important to point the fact that some women actually were sort of operating in the interstices of some of these categories. We have women who are part of the, essentially hired by the Ottoman Turkish military as nurses, and that's how they survive and they avoid deportation. But at the same time, they use their position in order to help save other women who don't have that kind of privileged position. So on the one hand, they are assisting the war effort on the side of the perpetrator state, and on the other, they're trying to thwart the impact of the genocide.
So my work focuses on the Holocaust, and to be quite honest, I don't think a single scholar, and certainly not a single scholar in one short evening of discussion, can do justice to the amount of research that has been done about women's experiences during the Holocaust. So just with that caveat, I'll focus in a little bit on sexual violence, and I think the way I think it might be useful to look at violence against women, specifically against women during the Holocaust, is to understand it maybe as gender-based violence as opposed to sexual violence or sexual assault. Women were certainly targeted. I mean, and I think the other important thing to say is that the Holocaust unfolded at different rates in different places, and people responded in different ways, and there were different policies in place. And so, and that's part of the difficulty in sort of talking about this in a short way, but in a sort of really concise way. But this idea, if we think about gender-based violence or sex-based violence as opposed to sexual assault, I think what we can see is some of the different ways that policy unfolded. And if we look at Nazi Germany itself before the genocide started, we see that the Nazis were interested in targeting women, Jewish women, for their reproductive capacity, and other women in German society because of their reproductive capacity. And in that context, things look like creating conditions in which Jewish women would be maybe discouraged to have children, and would be discouraged to stay in Germany at all. Then I think what I'll do then is just look maybe specifically at Auschwitz, where my work focuses. And actually, I think another thing that's important to say is that sexualized violence, sexual assault, rape as a tool of genocide was not really a characteristic of the Holocaust. And for a number of years, scholars believed that sexual violence was an extremely rare occurrence during the Holocaust. More recent scholarship has shown that while it was not as perhaps as widespread as in other genocides, it certainly took place. I mean, we see these situations where there were extreme power differentials in a variety of contexts, and male and female perpetrators took advantage of those power differentials to perpetrate specifically sexualized violence. So looking at Auschwitz, I find it really difficult, actually, in the context of that particular camp anyway, to sort of discern or sort of piece apart the difference between general violence and sexualized violence. They seem very intertwined to me, and various kinds of violence were just constantly present for women and men alike in Auschwitz, from the moment they arrived until the moment they either perished or liberation, and even after liberation. Some of the what did that look like during the initiation process? For example, women were forced to strip in public. There were typically male guards who were leering at them, often fondling them, verbally humiliating them. They had all of their body hair shaved, and sometimes their body cavities were searched. Women almost universally experienced this as sexual violence, and many of them feared further sexual assault. We also see once they were initiated into the camp and inside the camp, there was sometimes sexual violence perpetrated against them by other prisoners, sometimes by women guards, certainly by male guards. I think one of the important things to note is that if women were visibly pregnant when they arrived in Auschwitz, they were sent immediately to the gas chambers. And if their pregnancy was discovered at any point along the way, they were murdered. And what else do I want to say about this? I think one thing I do want to say is that it's important when looking at the Holocaust to see sexuality, and this is a new area of research, sexuality not only as something that was used for violence, that there were women who were targeted by the Nazis who engaged in sexuality in order to try to survive. So they used their agency, their sexual agency, to find comfort, to secure items that they needed, and for and for a variety of other reasons. So I hope that I like I said, I can't do this topic justice, but I hope I've given you some kind of sense of kind of the range of sexualized violence that women experience and how they responded to that.
No, this is wonderful. Thank you so much to all three of you. And there are many issues that emerge from your comments, but one of them is has to do with the limits of using categories, right? So we are creating categories of behavior for women, right? Identifying them as victims or as perpetrators, right? And yet the question, I'm going to ask the question anyway of women as perpetrators, which is in a way an unexpected role to some degree, and you should feel free to comment on that. But the real question that I want to ask is, how do female perpetrators fit into existing or newly created power structures in the context of genocide? Is there a process whereby they take advantage of existing or newly established power structures in the different contexts that you study? And anyone can start off. Sarah Cushman, if you want to start off, or we can go in the same order. You should just feel free to.
Sure, I'd be happy to start off. I think for a number of years in the field of Holocaust studies, women, sort of broadly speaking, were considered victims, whether they were were members of the perpetrator society or not. And so fortunately, we've had some really good work done recently, which has shown that women did indeed take advantage of new power structures and found themselves. So I think there's a point in time where people were characterizing the Holocaust as a place where racial hierarchy sort of became more important than gender hierarchy, and that it was, and there was some talk about like this is the first time that it ever happened. I disagree with that. I think that there's been a lot of places where racial hierarchies have at least complicated gender hierarchies, and this was one of them. And what we see is women. I think Wendy Lauer's work, Elizabeth Harvey's work, they all sort of show how women were able to participate in the process of genocide, primarily through supportive roles. So it's very rare that we see women sort of on the front lines of genocidal process during the Holocaust. They're typically not in the killing fields of Eastern Europe, like actually murdering people. They're not in the camps, pouring the Zyklon B into the gas chambers. They're not the leaders of the genocide, but they certainly took advantage of these opportunities to be supportive of their male compatriots in carrying out the genocide. We see these roles in Eastern Europe, for example, of women being secretaries, nurses, educators, social workers, wives, and so on. And we see some of these categories in Auschwitz as well. There are SS wives in the camp. There are obviously women guards in the camp. There are also these women auxiliaries who were responsible for telecommunications, and there were nurses there as well. We see women in two of these roles participating in violence inside the camp. Again, not primarily as genocidaires, but in sort of being in this place where they now have power that is unrestricted. And so women in the women's camp, they're carrying out their violence primarily against other women, occasionally against male prisoners, but mostly against other women. And it looks much like the sort of the violence that happens between male guards and male prisoners. So a lot of really violent abuse brutality, humiliation, some of the things that I talked about in my previous answer. Extreme brutality for small infractions of the plethora of rules that were taking place, the capricious enforcement of rules, and so on. So we see that for the camp guards. The other group of women that were violent, less violent, but exploitative were SS wives in the context of Auschwitz. And they particularly, they tended to use exploited prisoner labor in their homes. So by using them for childcare, household chores and things like that. And that was tended to be less violent, as I said, than guards. Then these two other groups, nurses and auxiliaries, they were much more supportive roles. The nurses were there primarily, they didn't really engage with prisoners at all. They were there for the care and welfare of members of the SS. And interacted very rarely with prisoners, occasionally with male prisoners if they interacted with prisoners at all. And then these communication experts, they were responsible for radio, telephone, telegraph operations. They certainly knew what was going on. One of the interesting things but they had no interaction with prisoners. One of the interesting things about them, though, is that Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, he had created this core of women who these telecommunications experts were part of this group of women who were supposed to be sort of the racial, a racial pool of a pool of racially adequate women who could marry SS men. And so these were women who were committed Nazis, who were very supportive of what the Nazis were doing. And so I argue that they were perhaps maybe even higher in the hierarchy of perpetrators than women camp guards were. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
So one thing I want to just chime in on and piggyback on a little bit is this idea that during instances of genocide, traditional gender roles break down alongside rule of law and other institutions. I think we see that across the board in every instance of genocide. So I don't think it's surprising that women participate as perpetrators, for example, because they are participating in a widespread social movement in whatever spaces they are allowed. It's not to say that everybody is given writ large and all of a sudden equal rights alongside that. I think that kind of flies in the face of something that, it mimics something that Cynthia Enloe warns about, which is this idea that war is liberating for women, not necessarily. But there is a breakdown in traditional roles, gender roles, which does facilitate and create spaces into which women enter because they exercise their agency no matter what the constrictions are. And the example of Rwanda that I wanted to cite is the role of women in facilitating and perpetrating theft in particular during the genocide. I think this speaks both to that breakdown in societal norms that would have normally dictated interpersonal relationships, and you don't steal from your neighbor, you don't steal from your friends, you don't steal from individuals, but it also speaks to a shift in the gender norms that dictated women's behavior that they were even actively engaged in that. So I just want to say women perpetrators for sure, their experiences during the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, they can't be characterized as fully liberating. They were still granted just a modicum of agency. Nonetheless, the fact that they were even mobilized, sensitized to participate, and given those spaces in which they exercised some agency, even if it was at the fringes, less so at the center, or in engaging in what I would call direct violence, that's still revolutionary in the Rwandan context. In the terms of just studying genocide across the board, it's not that revolutionary. We see it time and time again, and I suspect Khachik's got some ideas on this too.
Yeah, this idea of women playing a supportive role is also quite common in the Armenian genocide. We see this in a number of ways. Often we see that women find themselves in a position that, again, to borrow from Sarah Brown's intervention, a particular space is created for essentially playing a role as perpetrators. So for instance, to take a violent manifestation of this, in many cases, and sexual violence was rampant during the Armenian genocide. And one phenomenon was the abduction of Armenian girls and women. And oftentimes the gendarmes or others who were engaged in these actions would bring these women back home. And typically, these women would be forced to live in a space alongside other women, including the gendarme's wife or the individual's wife or wives. And in this kind of dynamic, in this kind of situation, it's easy to see the complicating environment that's being created, right? Particularly with this new individuals coming in, the kind of perceptions of threat from the different hierarchies of power that are in place, and the way in which oftentimes, of course, the Armenian girls and women are going to be on the receiving end of violence from both the other women in the household as well as the men. In other ways that are less overtly violent, we have in the cases of the concentration camps in the Syrian desert that I write about, we have many cases where women are playing an active role. These camps were semi-porous in the sense that people, particularly merchants, but also locals, were allowed to come in and purchase children oftentimes, or in these situations where people in these camps were just dying of disease and starvation. And one way for people to try to save their children was essentially to sell them. And we see here as well many accounts from survivors talking about the challenges and the difficult choices that families had to make, but also how many women would actually come from nearby towns and villages and would insist and would try to, over and over again to purchase these children until the families in some cases would be in such abject, horrendous circumstances that they would relent and sell the children or just give them away in hopes that they would survive. In many ways, I also want to comment on Sarah Cushman's earlier point about how women also use sexual agency to survive. Because in the Armenian case as well, we see this, the narrative that is often highlighted and emphasized in the Armenian case, not just in the scholarship, in fact, primarily in the public discourse, is one where women committed suicide in order to maintain the honor of the nation or their honor. But we know that human beings are making choices every moment, and these choices did include, in many cases, women actually engaging in and exercising sexual agency within that narrow options that they did have. And we do see some male observers, survivors, later on writing memoirs and being shocked about this phenomenon at that point. And but it was very much part of that experience as well. So I just wanted to add that to the earlier comment. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. I just have a quick follow-up question about the question of women as victims. And I'm wondering if you have encountered in your research, any of you, any evidence of the fact that the dynamic between female perpetrators and victims, how is this dynamic? Is there any difference between the way they relate to male victims versus female victims? Before we move on to the survivors, I just wanted to ask this follow-up question. Anyone, if you've encountered that in your research,
It sort of speaks to it in a tangential way, but I've been often asked about the dynamic between women perpetrators and victims of sexual violence. So women perpetrators of sexual violence and their victims. During the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, there were instances where Tutsi men and boys were raped by women. And we often tend to think about rape in these highly gendered terms. And we have a lot of assumptions. Women are victims and the men are the perpetrators. And while this is often true, I mean, generally, I think it's a more widespread phenomenon. This gendered lens that we use to examine this crime has also masculinized rape perpetration and then feminized its victims. But one of the things that I stress over and over, and what I've found in my limited findings on this, is that rape really is more about aggression, and it doesn't know any gender boundaries. Though the stigma that is associated with rape has resulted in a significant reporting gap. Men are less likely to report experiences of sexual violence as a result of this. Still, I heard repeated stories and anecdotes from survivors talking about the rape of Tutsi men and boys by women, and it was horrific and it was brutal. And one of the survivors was willing to speak to me about his experience. But one thing I also want to stress is that there wasn't, and this is anecdotal, there wasn't a significant discrepancy in how those women perpetrators treated their victims versus men perpetrators. It was still about aggression and violence and hate. And I wouldn't want to delve into one of these. There's a tremendous book by Schoberg and Gentry called Mothers, Monsters, and Whores. And they talk about this mother monster whore paradigm that we associate with women perpetrators in particular. And I want to avoid that pitfall, casting them as some sort of freak anomaly that was especially more egregious, especially more violent. In this instance, that was not my finding. So tangential answer.
I just want to follow that up, follow up Sarah's comment, because I think for a long time, and this came from survivor testimony. A lot of times, women perpetrators inside Auschwitz were characterized as more violent than their male counterparts. I'm not sure how one would actually measure that. I think that has to do with perceptions of how perceptions or expectations of how people would behave, and that women were behaving in a violent way at all. I think caused some people to characterize it as more violent. And I also just did want to talk a little bit about female perpetration of sexualized violence and male victims of sexualized violence. I think it's understudied in the Holocaust. I'm only aware of a single instance, but I can't imagine it's the only one of a woman carrying out sexual violence against a man. But it was a very interesting kind of like this kind of triangular kind of situation. I don't want to go into details about it, but that's the only one that I recall. But certainly there's been a lot more research recently about male on male sexual violence in the concentration camps, and I think that's a really important area of study. That's really there's some literature out there about it now, but it's being explored more diligently right now.
Just a very brief note as a follow-up on these points. In terms of reporting, in the case of the Armenian genocide as well, we have a couple of points to make. One about the fact that men, particularly boys who faced sexual violence, did not, of course, or even less likely to talk about it. I too have one case in which a boy experiences it and then writes about it in a memoir. And however, it's important to note that in the Armenian case as well, even though we know that rape was just widespread during the Armenian genocide, and we know many survivors who were women writing about it, most of the time they're writing about rape that happened to other people. And it is so often this occurs that it's so common that, and one would ask, right? Like, is there, why is this always happening to someone else, right? And of course, the structures, the dynamics, particularly in the aftermath as well, and the inability of many women to deal with this, to tackle these experiences, speak about them, is largely because of that. We do have some accounts where women will, audio recordings, even interviews, where women will clearly ask the interviewer to pause, and she will tell her story. And then the recording will resume. And then, what we can only assume is happening there is an act is rape. And but again, that would not be in the recording.
Okay, thank you, Kachik. So unfortunately, we are almost running out of time. I think that the next time the museum organizes this event, we should have 2 or 3 hours because you know, there's so many aspects that of this topic that need to be covered, but we don't have much time. So and we want to leave time for the Q&A. So I want to ask our panelists to be super concise with the next question, which really addresses the reality of post-genocidal society. And the question is, does the fight for justice look different for female survivors? And how do they interact with the justice system in place in post-genocidal society? And anyone can jump in. Kachik, if you want to go first, or anyone.
Sure. Just very briefly, in the Armenian case, justice took different forms in the absence of, you know, there were several efforts to bring the perpetrators to justice by the British. Ultimately, most of these efforts and others, ultimately, most of these efforts fail because of the changing dynamics on the ground in Turkey and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey. One of the challenges of the aftermath that particularly impacted women was that on the one hand, many of these women, particularly those who had escaped from sexual slavery and had returned to the Armenian community, faced you know, the additional challenge of not being able to tell their stories, particularly the violent and aspects of it and the component that was related to rape. Some of them, many of them, were forced to leave their children behind, the children they had with their abductor, and this was an added dimension. In the case of the struggle for justice, it wasn't for a very long time. It had very little to do with courts. There was a campaign and what is referred to as the Armenian Nuremberg, which was an attempt to assassinate the lead perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. It's called the operation called Operation Nemesis. There were some women who played supporting role in that operation, but not as main actors, as the main assassins. And I'll stop here.
I'm happy to chime in because I think Rwanda actually stands out as a rather unique example in the context of justice and the society grappling with the role of women after the genocide. And I'll focus on Gacaca in particular for this question, which was the national hybrid courts that were launched in Rwanda and ran from a pilot phase in 2004 nationwide in 2006 until 2012. Now, to Rwanda's credit, Gacaca really departed from its traditional patriarchal origins, which were based upon a traditional mediation process that focused on men as the final arbiters of this mediation process. When they launched even just the election process for the Inyangamugayo, the judges who would sit on these Gacaca panels in 2001, the elections were designed to include that men and women and ensure that the selection process would include both. In addition, Gacaca tried men and women alike, and because the judicial mechanisms within Gacaca encouraged confession in exchange for reduced sentencing, we saw an exponential increase, I think, in the number of women who were implicated by perpetrators by confessors as fellow perpetrators. So by perpetrators who are identifying other perpetrators. So as a result, by the time Gacaca had closed, we had a previous estimate of about 3,000 women who had participated in the genocide and were awaiting some sort of justice tribunal. By the end of Gacaca, which tried about 1.9 million cases, and of those cases perpetrated by 1,003,227 suspected perpetrators, we see 96,653 of them were women. That's nearly 10%. This is extremely significant. That having been said, I do not know if it is accurate, especially because when you hear from survivor anecdotes who talk about this idea of the invisibility of women perpetrators, the women perpetrators who they witnessed or they were victimized by, them never being brought to justice, and them alluding to this idea that maybe we're used to seeing men perpetrate crimes, but women are mothers, women are nonviolent, women are peaceful, they are the respectful ones, and so as a result, they are still invisible.
Thanks for the question. I don't have a huge amount to say about this, with the exception, I think we can all agree that very few Holocaust perpetrators were brought to justice. I would say that the number of women tried was roughly equivalent to their representation in the sort of in the Guard Corps. But very few women outside of the Guard Corps who were part of the perpetrator nation were even considered people that the international community might be interested in prosecuting. With regard to survivors, there were some contexts in which women survivors were involved in giving testimony. I think two sort of interesting cases of one of the very early trials is the Belson trial. There were a number of women defendants in that trial and a number of women who gave testimony in an effort to try to bring them to justice. And then also during the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial in the early 1960s. Again, don't think there were any women brought to trial, but certainly a number of women who gave testimony and affidavits at that trial.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think we're going to switch gears now and start with the Q&A, and then we might come back to the other questions. But for Sarah Cushman, actually, the first question: what about brothels in the camps during the Holocaust? Was there any agency there in women saving their own lives, or were they forced into it? Is there much research on this area?
Thanks for the question. There's a little bit of research on this, and it's not the focus of my work. I can tell you a little bit about it. There seems to be so there were brothels in the camp. There were several kinds of brothels in the camps. One, there were brothels for privileged male prisoners, and there were brothels for the SS. Prisoners were sometimes used for both of these. In neither case were Jewish women knowingly put into the brothels. There is some evidence that most of this was coercion. I think a lot of scholars consider it sexual slavery. I certainly would include myself among those scholars. There were also there is some evidence that there were instances where women were promised that if they volunteered for the brothels, that they would be released in 6 months. My understanding is that did not happen. In the time that they were in brothels, the women they had, generally speaking, cleaner, I was going to say better living conditions, but I would say cleaner, more hygienic living conditions, access to a little bit more food, and were obviously engaged in really horrific labor, but of a different kind than prisoners who were working in other contexts. Yeah, so not a huge amount of research, but some research has been done.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Another question for all three panelists: what research, if any, is still missing in the field? What are the new directions in the field of women in genocide studies? I mean, I guess that's Sarah.
More of it.
The end of your question kind of hinted at what is still missing, but yeah. Anything else that you would like to?
Yeah, I mean, there's that. I think one of the things that I'm really encouraged about is that so this idea of for a number of years when scholars spoke about gender, they meant women, and so I think the vocabulary has been corrected, and so today we're talking about women in genocide. I think that's correct, but people are starting to look at starting to use gender as a tool for not only analyzing women's experiences, but also analyzing men's experiences. I mean, men are also gendered beings, and I think that's important to understand that they experienced genocide and have experienced genocide as gendered beings, and they were have been targeted during the Holocaust and other genocides as men. I think that's an important area of study. It's still that's still a new new period, a new area of study. And I don't know how much that's been applied to other genocides. To my knowledge, none. But but I don't know for sure. And then I think also one of the areas that's being explored that's really interesting is the sort of the various gray zones of in the Holocaust. I think in my work and what we see in the camps is that the prisoners who are in the prisoner hierarchy have historically been spoken about as coming only from sort of criminal categories, or a group that the Nazis called antisocial or asociale. And I think people are starting to understand, or scholars are starting to look at these groups as containing many more types of prisoners. My own work shows that Jewish women entered the prisoner hierarchy within months, if not weeks, of the establishment of the women's camp in Auschwitz. And I think we're understanding this is an effort by people to survive. And I think for a long time, women in these categories, or prisoners in these sort of intermediate gray area categories, were thought of as people who, for some, had like bought into Nazi ideology in some way, and who were sort of joining forces with the Nazis. And I think that's really generally speaking, a mistaken view. I think that we have to look at these people who are in really constrained situations, who are also exhibiting really agency in some of the few ways that they actually could. And I think that's a really important and interesting direction.
Yeah, in the Armenian, oh, sorry. Yeah, in the Armenian case, it's worth noting that the scholarship for a very long time on the Armenian genocide has been largely been a reaction to the Turkish Republic having actively engaging in the denial of the Armenian genocide, and in that sense, that the policy of denial that begins from, in fact, the moment the genocide is being essentially unleashed, and continues into the Turkish Republic as the heirs of the genocide perpetrators, and the state engages in this. Much of the scholarship on the Armenian genocide, even though the Armenian genocide is the second best case, best studied case, has neglected and focused less on the experiences of on many aspects that we see quite well documented and studied in the case of the Holocaust, for instance, but particularly issues related to the role played by victims, the role played, the issues of gender. To give an example, much of what there is out there on the Armenian genocide and women is about the victimization and the rape of women. There's a lot more to be explored there that is just now being explored. Regarding the aftermath and the reintegration of many of these women who were sexually enslaved into the Armenian community, there is some good work by several scholars who've done exceptional work on that, but still there too, there's much work that needs to be done. In many ways, I think oftentimes the challenge has been, and this is now we're sort of breaking free from that over the past decade, I would say, there's been this effort to really, because this drive to constantly disprove denialist rhetoric and discourse has become less significant. Scholars are delving deeper into other issues, and I do think there's, as I said, much to be explored there in terms of gender, in terms of those who operated, as I mentioned earlier, in the interstices of bystander and survivor and all these categories that we talk about, and particularly the aftermath and the role of patriarchy and the way in which it interacted in the Armenian community, and the way in which that operated and impacted, and both during the genocide and after.
I'm lucky in that you had such wonderful and comprehensive answers from my two flag is that Sarah's research actually on women in Auschwitz actually really was part of what inspired me to do my research. And so what I'm going to argue for is more. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. In order to be a part of the present and the future, women must also be accurately represented in the past. And that has to be the full and complicated version of women. And thanks to people like Sarah who are doing that kind of work, and Khachik, who actually, I remember when you first nodded to me about the idea of women exercising agency as survivors. And that this whole new idea that I hadn't even thought about. The more we're doing this work, the more we're speaking to one another, the greater we're going to build a larger body of work and a larger understanding and a more complicated and nuanced narrative. Specific to Rwanda, I would love to see more work on women rescuers, because I think that Rwanda would greatly benefit from not just the cautionary tales of perpetration, but also role models, people that they could and should emulate. So that's one area I'd love to see grow out.
Okay, so the three of you have a lot to work because you just promised us much more. So we want to read the result of these promises. So I think we have one last question, and it's for all three of you. How does the unique impact of genocide on women help us better understand the overall dynamics of mass violence? What are the dangers of failing to acknowledge women's experiences in genocide? And anyone can jump in.
I think Sarah Brown just hit on some of the dangers. Is that I think for a long time women's experiences during genocide weren't studied, and that was because women were on the margins of society, and on the margins of scholarship, and weren't doing the scholarship. And when feminist women started getting involved in scholarship and started to ask the questions about what was happening to women, then we see women in history. And when we see women in history, then we see women in the present. And I agree that this, the complicated, nuanced understanding of how women are, that that women aren't civilizing influence necessarily. I think that's all really important. And then the unique impact of genocide on women. How does it help us understand the dynamics of mass violence? Well, I don't know if I have a specific answer to that question. And I think this is also much like Sarah's answer. It's just more information is more information, right? It's more nuanced. By looking at women's experiences, we get a more nuanced understanding of how mass violence unfolds in a variety of different contexts. So, so I think, so the unique impact of genocide on women, I think it's more the more work that we do, the more we come to understand, and the more different kinds of people that we focus our research on, the more nuanced our understanding of mass violence and how it unfolds becomes.
Yeah, in many ways, when we're writing about genocide, and it's not just trying to write an integrated history that really tells the full, demonstrates the full picture, right? In many ways, I mean, obviously, it's good scholarship, but there's something beyond that as well, which is that ultimately, how we think about these challenges and issues are very much part of how we think about current our realities in the here and now as well, right? In many ways, right? If we go on thinking about, say, the Holocaust or the Armenian Genocide or the Rwanda Genocide in a particular way, and we're not prompted and encouraged to ask certain questions, right, about dynamics and about gender and about what we are doing is we're neglecting the same elements in the here and now. One of the things I do in my teaching is I actually ask my students, what can you tell in a minute about, say, the Armenian Genocide or the Holocaust? And then we discuss that and how we're telling the story and what we are not mentioning and why does it matter? And then how much that actually impacts the way we tell stories in the here and now about human rights violations, about just any kind of crime that's taking place, and how sometimes we try to strip the victim from agency just as if in order to emphasize how heinous and horrible the crime is, right? As if by reducing or minimizing or rendering the victim hopeless and helpless, we're essentially making the case for how horrible the crime that is being committed is. And oftentimes, in many of these cases, in many of these instances, we will be neglecting the role of those who are the subaltern, the role of women, and ultimately what's going to happen is that, again, it's not just about good scholarship. I think it's about just being a good, period, right? And it completely changes our perspective of how we think about the work.
If I can expound on what Khachik was just saying, it isn't just good scholarship, and we don't study genocide or women during instances of genocide purely for historical purposes. There's also a real policy implication here. So if you're studying these instances of genocide with a mind towards preventing or intervening effectively in current or future instances of mass atrocities, if you don't know what 50% of the population or more, depending on the country, if you don't know what 50 or more % of the population is doing, or you have gendered assumptions that make them invisible to you when thinking about your prevention, intervention policies, they're not going to be effective policies. And so it isn't just, I'm going to build on that. It isn't just good scholarship, it's also good. And it's also solid when you're thinking from a policy standpoint, it's solid research. The data will speak for itself.
Wonderful. I am so thankful to the three of you. This has been really, for me, such a learning experience. I'm going now to hand it over to Annie. I'm sorry it's over, though.
Thank you all so much. To Elisa's earlier point, I know this could go on for hours and hours. We actually had a request from an audience member to make a whole series about it. So maybe we'll look into that so we can have many more conversations about the topic. Thank you so much to Sarah Brown, Sarah Cushman, Khachik, and Elisa for being with us tonight. Really enlightening conversation. I know a lot more to cover, so we appreciate you spending your evening with us. Thank you again to everyone watching with us, to our community partners. We hope to see you next time. Everyone stay safe and have a great rest of your evening. Good night.